Okay, friends, I don't want to keep you waiting anymore, and hopefully this will work the way that I'm hoping it's supposed to work. Um, Good evening. I'm pleased and privileged to welcome you both on Zoom and Facebook Live to an evening with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. It's an honor to have Liz joining us this evening. Before I continue, a couple of ground rules. We are muting all participants here on Zoom except for Liz and my co-hosts. We'll have a time for questions and answers after Liz finishes her prepared remarks, beginning with a few questions that we've prepared in advance. We invite you to submit questions of your own, beginning or via the chat function on Zoom, and we'll try to get as many of those questions in as we can. And if you have any other questions related to this broadcast, you can submit them via chat as well. Just a little background on the Poor People's Campaign. It's a campaign that has become a powerful and important voice in these troubled times. If you've not followed this work or become a part of it, I hope this evening's program will move you to join and to encourage your families, your friends, your congregations, and others to do so as well. The Poor People's Campaign was originally the vision of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and partners. They sought to build a broad fusion movement that could unite poor and impacted communities across the country. Today, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has picked up Dr. King's unfinished work. From the Poor People's Campaign website, in this campaign, people are coming together to confront the interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. We understand as a nation that we are at a critical juncture, that we need a movement that will shift the moral narrative, impact policies and elections at every level of government, and build lasting power for poor and impacted people. So Liz is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, along with Reverend Dr. William Barber II. I happen to know this has been a dream for Liz for many years, and it's gratifying to see that all her hard work to make it happen has borne fruit in this spectacular way. Together, they have organized the largest coordinated wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century, in 21st century America, and it has emerged as one of the nation's leading social movement forces. But before I go any further, I want to introduce the Reverend Di Morgan. He's the interim executive director for the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, and he's the director of United Methodist Advocacy in Pennsylvania. Di is joining us this evening to offer a special welcome on behalf of the council. So, Di.
Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, I welcome you. And I'm so pleased that we are able to host this event this evening. The mission of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches is to promote Christian unity among the many and varied Christian traditions. And I'd like to point out that unity is not the same as uniformity. I think that our great differences are really a strength, and that there is an important effort in being united and showing that to the world. We fulfill our mission at the Pennsylvania Council of Churches through two avenues, and one is through ecumenical programming, and the other is through political and social advocacy. And Sandy is our director of advocacy, and I am so pleased and proud that she has put this event together this evening. And I myself look forward to hearing from Dr. Theoharis. Thank you.
Okay. Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is uniquely qualified for the work of this campaign. In addition to being a co-chair of the campaign, she's also the director of the Kairos Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Liz received her BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, her MDiv from Union Theological Seminary in 2004, where she was the first William Sloane Coffin Scholar, and her PhD from Union in New Testament and Christian Origins. She's been published in the New York Times, Times Magazine, CNN, The Guardian, Sojourners, The Nation, and others. In 2018, she gave the Building a Moral Movement TED Talk at TED Women. She was named the Women of Spirit recipient from the Presbyterian Church USA. She received the Selma Bridge Award in 2018. She's one of the Politico 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries whose ideas are driving politics. One of 11 women shaping the church by Sojourners, and one of 15 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress just this year. Liz is the author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, which was published in 2017. She is co-author of Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, which I'm proud to say I'm part of as well, and I'm glad that she's one of us, and she teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Friends, I give you the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and Reverend Morgan, and everybody for joining us. I'm honored to be with you all this evening. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was calling for the Poor People's Campaign in December of 1967, he said, "There is nothing wrong with a traffic law which says that you have to stop for a red light. But when a fire is raging, the fire truck goes right through that red light, and normal traffic had better get out of its way. Or when a man is bleeding to death, the ambulance goes through those red lights at top speed. There is a fire raging now for the poor of this society. They are living in tragic conditions because of the terrible economic injustices that keep them locked in. Disinherited people all over the world are bleeding to death from deep social and economic wounds. They need brigades of ambulance drivers who will have to ignore the red lights of the present system until the emergency is solved." Although Dr. King said this more than 50 years ago, I really believe that these words ring true today. In a nation that has lost more than 200,000 of God's children to the novel coronavirus, we hear ambulances driving through red lights because of that COVID pandemic on a pretty regular basis. There are fires raging across California and Oregon and Washington and the rest of the world because indeed the world's on fire in this climate crisis. Too many Black people, Native and Indigenous people, poor people are bleeding on our streets at the hands of the police, at the will of policy violence from deep social and economic wounds. And even before this pandemic, there were 140 million poor and low-income people, now millions more who have joined those locked in by economic injustice. But this is where a movement comes in. Times like these call for signing up brigades of ambulance drivers. Ambulance drivers who have to run through the red lights on the lack of education and transportation, the red lights of sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and discrimination against the elderly and the young and the disabled and the deaf and the hard of hearing. Red lights of closed polling places, attacks on the postal service, racist gerrymandering, and all forms of voter suppression. We have to run through the red lights of poverty and homelessness and low wages and unemployment and overall abandonment in the midst of abundance. And these ambulance drivers, and I'm calling you all in Pennsylvania to be them, have to come forward in power. Come forward with bold, visionary solutions to deep social and economic wounds. Come forward to heal and transform the nation. Come forward and declare jubilee. Liberation to those who are not free, healing to those who are sick, justice for all who seek it. So this evening, in this part of the conversation, I want to talk about both the power of poor and low-income people voting, as well as this concept of jubilee. For the last 3 years, as Sandy said, the Poor People's Campaign has organized amongst the 140 million Americans in poverty or one fire, one storm, one job loss, one healthcare crisis away from poverty, who have decided that it's time to build the power to change our nation. This past June, we held the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington, where nearly 3 million people joined on social media alone. And 2 weeks ago, we held a mass assembly on voter participation and protection called Voting is Power Unleashed, where more than 1 million people joined and heard about efforts to mobilize, organize, register, and educate people for a movement that votes. We invited both presidential candidates to come speak to our agenda at this event. Trump did not respond, but Joe Biden joined us and told our assembly that if he's elected, ending poverty will be his theory of change. We heard that, and if elected, we'll hold him to that. Before these assemblies, we held the first ever Poor People's Moral Action Congress. We've testified in front of caucuses and committees. We've presented our budget and agenda to the House Budget Committee. We've engaged in grassroots mobilizing and organizing. We've pulled together low-income people, advocates, activists, moral leaders, and clergy. And again, as Sandy said, we organized the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience at state capitals when we launched, and we've stayed in action ever since. We are building the political power and the moral vision to reconstruct these yet to be United States. And this past August, we released a groundbreaking report that proves empirically what we've always known, that poor and low-income people can become a transformative new electorate. Eligible poor and low-income voters in 15 states with just a small uptick in their voting, between 1% and 19%, exceed the margin of victory for the 2016 presidential election. And poor and low-income voters in 16 states with just a small uptick in voting, between 1% and 19%, exceed the margin of victory in the 2018 midterms. All across the country, poor and low-income people demand accountable representation and are rising in power to save the soul of this democracy. That's happening in Louisiana, where in St. James Parish, where often called Cancer Alley, or in Michigan's deindustrialized cities of Detroit and of Flint, Community leaders are there pledging to vote for candidates who confront the petrochemical disaster in Cancer Alley, the water crisis in Michigan, and this overall crisis of poverty and pandemic and racism in our society. Low-wage workers in North Carolina and Florida and Wisconsin are demanding policies of living wages, paid sick leave, and union rights. Homeless students in California and Massachusetts and Virginia call on a political system to stand for public education, for debt relief, for housing programs, and for voting rights. There in Pennsylvania, small town people and small town folk in Alabama as well are insisting that candidates keep rural hospitals open and enact universal health care. And so for the past few months and for the next 20 plus days, the Poor People's Campaign is intensifying the work that we're doing amongst poor and low-income voters, especially in states who again have poor and low-income people who can exceed the margin of victory for this election and also have key US Senate races. We've rolled out a campaign to expand our base, to register millions of voters, and to protect voting rights. We in the Poor People's Campaign say and sing this line, somebody's hurting our people. It's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. The work we're doing and our movement shows just this. It also shows that we must hold out hope and vision of what has not yet been, but what could be if the United States were to really shift the narrative about poverty and really build the power of the poor. What it could be if we were to actually declaring Jubilee. I want to talk a little bit about this idea, this vision for society, a vision that is realizable in our own time. The word Jubilee comes from the Hebrew Yovel, meaning a trumpet blast of liberty. It was said that on the day of liberation, the sound of a ram's horn would ring through the land. Our Jewish brothers and sisters have just celebrated the highest holidays over the past few weeks. Last Tuesday, the day after Yom Kippur, Jewish rabbis sounded the shofar, that ram's horn, in front of the Senate offices and Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., declaring that our society still is in need of justice. We must still work for the rights of all people. Now is the time. Now is the time for Jubilee. Not because we're living in scarcity. The only scarcity we have is a scarcity of political will. There is enough for everyone, and that all are deserving of this nation's abundance. We have the saying in our work that when we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Our society desperately needs a moral revolution of values, and we'll have to depend on the leadership of those most impacted by injustice to help us lead the way. In the words of Frederick Douglass, those in pain know when their pain is relieved. Those who would be free must strike the first blow. And as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once suggested, power for poor people will mean having the capacity and the ability, the aggressiveness and the assertiveness, the togetherness and the power to force the power structure to say yes when they may be desirous to say no. Many people have said to me, and I'm sure you all have heard this, that ending poverty is too ambitious, especially in this moment, that such demands for all rights, all human rights, are both politically inconceivable and ridiculously too expensive. We can't believe that lie when we've seen trillions of dollars in the past couple of months funneled to the wealthiest in our society, when billionaires have made upwards of $845 billion, when the majority of people in this country, especially the poorest among us, have been told to fend for ourselves. And also, we must know that the benefits of investing in life, not death, far outweigh the costs. Child poverty already costs our country at a minimum an estimated $700 million annually. Voter suppression in Florida just a year ago added up to more than $385 million in administrative and court costs. Failing to address adequately climate change, failing to create a genuine green economy could cost 15.7% of our GDP every year. And endless wars, not to speak of the 800 US military bases scattered around the planet, cost hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars a year without making our country, our world, any safer. Instead of bankrolling war and the wealthy, Americans can shift $350 billion from the annual Pentagon budget, use it to enhance genuine security at home, and still have a larger military budget than China, Russia, and Iran combined. We could raise the federal minimum wage to a living one and experience a ripple effect of money being circulated back throughout the economy. The US could gain $886 billion in estimated annual revenue from a fair taxation system. Imagine a society that truly began to invest in public infrastructure, creating more and better jobs not related to the military, including accelerating a transition to clean energy. That would be good for our country and good for our planet. And in the process, we could provide healthcare and housing and education for everyone. In the richest country in human history, there are abundant resources, even if our public policies have funneled far too much to far too few for far too long. We can indeed declare Jubilee in this election season and beyond. The problems of 2020 clearly demand a Jubilee vision for the nation. And something in the wave of Black Lives Matter demonstrations and social uplift and social programming feels more possible than it has for generations. Reverend Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign alongside myself, often says that we are on the precipice of a third Reconstruction. In each of those previous Reconstructions, after the Civil War and with the ending of Jim Crow, monumental social, political, and economic changes were birthed by movements in the midst of insufferable conditions and in the face of regressive governments. The last few months offer evidence that growing segments of society are willing to imagine bold solutions to issues such as poverty and systemic racism, and are prepared to organize what could be this new Reconstruction and make this a reality. There are people still 7 months into this pandemic going on rent strikes. There are still powerful organizing efforts amongst low-wage workers. There's strong campaigns for both immediate relief, but then also permanent rights to housing and decent work. There's powerful organizing going on. The real heroes and heroines of our nation are uniting and organizing and mobilizing as we speak. Scarcity is a myth and nothing more. The money is there to be found, and in this moment, it needs to be. We can lift from the bottom, and everybody can rise. Social movements, especially when we're gaining ground, are told to be practical, to make demands few and modest. But it's worth noting that never the same is asked of the truly wealthiest in our society. So this idea of Jubilee, it's not a proposal to tinker around the edges. It's a plan for Reconstruction that hopes to address the pain and hope of millions of everyday people simply struggling for the right to live. The project of reconstructing society around the needs of the poor, and the low income and the dispossessed requires a movement led by them that involves everybody. And that is happening. That is growing. That is building. We may live in a time that essentializes poverty, that justifies tanks coming into our communities, that says it's not so bad, things are going to be just fine. But what we know is that it does not have to be this way. In the words of a Fight for 15 worker, Nick Smith, out of Appalachian, Virginia, our backs are against the wall. And so now all we can do is push. We as a people, in the words of our friends from Kentucky, from the hood to the holler, from the Bronx to the border, from the California coast to the Carolinas, are signing up to be ambulance drivers. We're readying ourselves to save the heart and the soul of this democracy, and we're moving forward together and not one step back. We need you all involved. We need to be aware that it's possible, and we need to mobilize and organize and register and educate people for a movement, but a movement that votes and protests and stays engaged for the long term, because that is the only thing that can save this nation and can make it be what it has not yet been, but can be for everyone. Just, peaceful, truthful, with love, lifting from the bottom, not being silent anymore, but coming forward in power. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. And what inspiring words for all of us, and what a call to action for all of us. Thank you for sharing what you have so far. Now, we would like to ask a few questions of you. We'll begin with a few pre-prepared questions, and we'll be working through any other questions that are submitted via chat, and we'll refer those once we get through the initial questions. Asking the questions this evening will be our newest staff member, Kelsey Reyes. She's an Episcopal Service Corps Fellow at the Sycamore House in Harrisburg. She's a 2020 graduate of Virginia Tech, and she's going to be with us for the next year doing work on a variety of advocacy issues, including criminal justice reform, gun violence, immigration, and others. So Kelsey, welcome, and please feel free to begin the questions.
Awesome. Okay, so first question being, in the report Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans, it found that if low-income voters participated at similar rates as higher-income voters and voted against the winning party, there are 15 states where new low-income voters could have flipped the results of the 2016 election. With that knowledge, how does the Poor People's Campaign plan to mobilize voters?
So I just think we should actually let that sink in, right? That there's 15 states where who holds the key to transformative, progressive policy, and to shifting who is in power and who they're accountable to, lies in the hands of poor and low-income people. In this election season, there still has not been enough conversation about the issues and demands that are impacting the majority of people in this country around poverty, around racism, around fracking, around environmental devastation, around the lack of healthcare. How is it that we're living in the worst healthcare crisis, public health crisis, in more than a century, and we have not expanded healthcare at all? In fact, tens of millions of people have lost it, right? So instead of spending all of this energy, all of this time, all of this money trying to win a couple of undecided voters, you have 34 million people who did not vote in the 2016 election, who are poor and low income, who, when they hear their name, when they hear their issues, when they hear their conditions, when they hear their demands, will be inspired to turn out and vote. There is massive voter suppression taking place, as well as the suppression of our democracy, because we aren't hearing these issues and because people are not coming forward with the kinds of solutions to those problems. And so the Poor People's Campaign isn't waiting for any politician to save us. We're saying we must do more, that we're going to mobilize and organize. We're going to reach out to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of poor and low income people, eligible voters. Between a quarter and a third of the entire electorate are poor and low income people. And yet, again, these issues are not in our daily political discourse. So we are reaching out and bringing those folks in. If you're interested, we're doing regular texting, calling, social distance canvassing, to literally thousands of communities right now. That's happening. And there are ways for folks to get involved if you're interested in the efforts that the Poor People's Campaign has. We've kind of rolled out a massive voter protection and participation program that starts with reaching out to poor and low income people and bringing folks into a movement, but into a movement that realizes power in part by voting, also by doing a whole lot of other things. But in this moment, when the key is in the hands of eligible poor and low income voters, but many of whom have not been inspired before to engage in the election, or some folks that have in 2008 or in other elections, but in the past years haven't been, then what we need to do is be able to reach out to folks, and not for a minute, not with just like coming to a poor community with some socks and passing them out and then never going back, or not just with lip service of saying I'm interested in these issues, but then again not coming back. But we as a movement are building up that power of that new electorate, and we have the potential as we're doing it to really shift the whole political landscape for everyone.
Awesome. Okay. In a time where voter purging and misinformation are large factors in why poor people do not vote, how does the campaign intend to make sure people are legally registered to vote and receiving correct information about voting?
So voter education and registration are really important, as is pushing back against voter suppression. Since 2013, there are 26 states who have formally passed racist voter suppression laws. And for too long, people have not been sounding the alarm. I mean, the fact that the last presidential election, we had fewer voter protections and voting rights than we had 50 years before should be, total anathema to this democracy. Despite folks dying for us to have those rights, fighting and dying. And so we're engaging in significant voter protection. We're working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Forward Justice, two kind of legal organizations. And we've kind of rolled out a whole voter protection plan where we're doing voter protection in targeted 10 states, 10 states that, again, are 10 of the 15 states where poor and low income people can really make the difference. 10 states and particular areas where already folks have been closing polling places, have been imposing new kind of restrictions on voting, especially amongst communities of color, amongst poor communities. And so I think in part what we're doing and what needs to happen is a continued sounding of the alarm on voter suppression. This was all happening before the most recent attacks. attacks on the Postal Service, upholding various voter suppression laws in the Supreme Court, and a decision that we're going to do more of that. Obviously these threats to both have voter intimidation at the polls, as well as really subvert our democracy by not listening to the will of the people and who gets elected. And so I think an awareness around those, but then also we're practically organizing so that we can really protect people's votes. At the same time as we're organizing and advocating for, Election Day becoming a holiday, and we're figuring out, transportation and childcare issues and low-wage work issues for low-income voters. And so I think it's both on a level of, raising consciousness and pushing back. Some of those legal organizations are putting forward lawsuits and cases where there's real evidence of this voter suppression. And then in terms of the registration part and the mobilization part, we have a tool that we're using that you can find on the For People's Campaign website, and you can find if you come through one of the We Must Do More trainings, that, where people can basically find out if they are registered, and then learn the requirements in their area for registration. We can't directly, especially socially distanced online in a pandemic, register as many folk as everyone might be liking. But what we can do is give people the resources and the tools to be informed about how you register, what the deadlines are, what the legal ramifications are, how you make sure your vote is counted. And so we're doing a lot of that kind of training, a lot of those kinds of calls. And then that's also where this massive texting and calling campaign comes in. And again, if people are interested, we have ongoing, moments when people, days, evenings, afternoons, when people are doing this work, and we always need more people involved.
Just to keep going with the concept of voter intimidation and suppression, recently there have been warnings of organized efforts where people will go to the polls and intimidate others from voting. So what is the campaign doing to ensure voter safety and prohibit voter intimidation? Is there any intention to have poll watchers there to fight not physically fight, but to protect people from voting?
So in these 10 states that we've identified with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and with Forward Justice, we are training poll monitors, and some of those poll monitors, most of them will come from those states themselves, but also some of them will come from other key places. There will be like a hotline to find out, be able to call and find out up to the minute, updates around where there is intimidation and suppression happening. Again, it's a whole team of folks that know lots of things that aren't necessarily my expertise, but where folks will be doing, and have also been trying to really encourage folks in all the states to be poll workers, because obviously in this pandemic, especially younger people, especially not immune compromised people, really we need a lot of folks that are willing to work the polls, because part of the having early voting in states, part of being able to keep polls open the hours that folks need to actually be able to vote, is connected to having enough poll workers. So we're both encouraging folks and helping, legal folks are helping folks to get connected to be poll workers, but then what we're doing is training folks to be poll monitors and to staff call-in lines where there's issues going on. I think what we also are putting out is a message that that there's always been intimidation and the threat of violence whenever, especially poor people, especially people of color, have asserted rights to vote. and that this is not a new problem. And what's also happened is that people have overcome and have been able to go and fight and win the right to vote and make sure their vote is counted and really fight for this democracy. And so it's important for us not to admit defeat or to be scared off or to think that all is lost. What we're seeing out there amongst lots of poor communities is that people are going to turn out in really big numbers. Folks are very seeing what's at stake, and are not going to be scared and intimidated by folks that are trying to really impoverish further this democracy.
Mm-hmm. You've been speaking a bit about the various legal organizations that has been working with the campaign. Could you talk a little bit more about what specific legal organizations you guys work with and what their roles are?
Yeah, so we have a whole kind of committee, and again, this isn't necessarily my I'm not the main person doing this work, but we have a whole committee of Poor People's Campaign leaders, lawyers from our midst, who are then working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. LDF is some of the original voting rights lawyers in this nation and have a long history of monitoring and fighting back and suing against voter suppression and to protect voting rights. And Forward Justice is the lawyers who actually won the most important and most significant voting rights case in Shelby, in North Carolina, a couple of years ago, where it was found that it was surgical racism, the level of voter suppression that was happening, and they found it, unconstitutional and got it overturned. And so the legal organizations are ones that are folks that are very aware, very familiar, and have real track records and victories around ensuring that people's right to vote is there. Both organizations have also worked around the restitution of voting rights for folks with criminal records, and some other campaigns to really protect and expand voting rights. And so, if people are interested in learning more, you can go to those websites. You can also go, the Poor People's Campaign, you can go two different ways to basically find out and get involved in some of this voter protection work, as well as the overall voter mobilization and participation work. You can go to vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org, or you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org/voting. Both will take you to a series of resources for you to be able to sign up to get involved and to learn a little bit more about all of this.
And my final prepared question is, you recently published an article speaking to the dangers of Christian nationalism. Could you address how we as people of faith might respond to this danger?
So I'm an anti-poverty activist. I know a bunch about policy and organizing, but really what I also am, and where my values come from, is that I'm a pastor and a biblical scholar. And for the past 25 years, as I've been doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing, a week really doesn't go by in my life when someone doesn't come forward to kind of justify an action in the face of poverty, and to say if God wanted to end poverty, God would do so, and to justify adherence to empire and the authorities, and really kind of misuse and misinterpret and misappropriate the Bible for the purpose of kind of holding up the powers and principalities. And I think that that is really a very dangerous form of Christian nationalism that is really gaining some strength in this moment, uh, both in this presidency and just as really decades have gone on of the main quote unquote moral and Christian voices being those who think that Jesus was a card carrying member of the NRA, think that the only issues are who you have sex with, like think that that prayer in schools is the way that we come forward in a more moral society, and ignore the 2,000 to 2,500 passages of the Bible that says that, welcoming the immigrant neighbor, organizing society around the needs of the poor, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, which is really the heart and core of our messages. And so for one, I think we can't see the Bible. I think we can't let the moral issues of our day be defined in a very narrow, individualistic, kind of immaterial kind of way. I think we have to cry out judgment and loudly when you have ruling authorities who double down on oppression in the midst of a pandemic. And I think we have to remind society that plagues always unmask foundations of injustice, and it's the duty of the people to then organize societies when the kind of blinders have been ripped off, in a way that actually promotes love and truth and peace and justice. And so one, I think we can't ignore that that's what's going on, and we can't cede the territory. We also need to come forward with people of faith and people not of faith, and build a movement from the ground up. Dr. King talks about the kind of Achilles heel, the weak point of a system that has militarism and racism and poverty all mixed together, is for the poor to take action together. And he says, the poor and dispossessed in our nation live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. So every morning, after I read various parts of the Bible, I read that King quote, and I say, what as a Christian leader am I doing that's helping poor people to take action together? What as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, am I doing to make sure that we restructure an edifice that produces beggars? What, as someone who follows and worships a God who led us out of Egypt, am I doing that's going to actually build a movement that brings God's reign here on earth? And I think we have to kind of battle it out in the battle for the Bible, the battle for our moral and constitutional and religious values. And we have to do it in the streets, in our communities, in our congregations. We have to build this moral movement from the ground up.
Yeah. Okay, so I finished my prepared remarks, and now I'm looking at a couple of questions in the chat. One is from Melissa, and I actually had kind of the same question, where she talks about rural towns in PA where you see a lot of Republicans and a lot of pro-Trump flags and just signs everywhere. And her question is, what is her question? Is the Poor People's Campaign focusing on these rural areas in addition to more urban areas? And I think that's a really good question.
It's a really important question. The center of gravity of all of the work of the Poor People's Campaign is in the 45 states that have come forward to be state committees, coordinating committees of the campaign. And it means not that people are just organizing in one city. It means that folks are committed to deep fusion organizing, crossing, especially in this country, racial barriers and geographic ones. So that we need rural people, we need small town folk, we need big city people all together organizing and seeing that that an injury to one is an injury to all. And we're finding a lot of success in that, whether it's in small town Pennsylvania or small town Alabama or small town Kentucky or even small town California. We are seeing folks, come together and find common cause and make unlikely alliances with people that look like them and look nothing like them and come from an experience that's similar to theirs and come from a experience that's nothing like theirs. But their experience in terms of trying to thrive and not just barely survive in this society that is a death dealing society, is really. And so that looks like, that if you look at our demands, that we lift up, water and sanitation and infrastructure, because in so many communities, those infrastructure developments just aren't there, and they never were in rural communities, right? That means that we lift up especially the predicament of rural hospitals and small town health crises. That means that, we're talking about jobs programs that aren't just for urban areas, but are about infrastructure development and just living wage jobs, everywhere in small towns and rural areas. That means, that we believe that education, in higher education, should be free, available to everybody, including especially, folks from inner cities, but then also from small towns and rural areas. And so if you and we never suggest policy prescriptions, and we never endorse policies that we haven't disaggregated the data around, which means what impact does it have on women? What impact does it have on Black people? What impact does it have on rural and small town people? What impact does it have on urban people, right? Because one of the dangers in our country's history is when you don't look at what policies are going to impact folks, then people get pitted against each other. What we saw, for instance, in Vermont, when folks were organizing around healthcare, was that folks won, quote unquote, healthcare on the backs of kicking people off of welfare rolls, right? And so you had some folks in these towns over here that needed healthcare, and these folks that needed better welfare benefits, and folks were instead, basically put in a position to fight each other instead of really realizing the promise that we could have it all. And so it's really important, actually, that this isn't just a campaign that's in big cities, inner cities, but it needs to be there, but it's also a campaign that is, throughout every kind of form of geography.
Karen asks a good question. What link can you provide for poll monitoring training?
Yeah, so again, folks should go to vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org and then find out if the places where there are still needed folks to do poll monitoring. We only have the capacity to be doing that work in these 10 states and in the communities that were identified by local leaders about where really that had to happen. But there's also resources for what everybody should know and what everybody can do. And so again, you can find that information at vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org.
Yeah, so that's all the questions I have. So Sandy?
There. Okay, well, before we sign off, first, Liz, thanks for your patience and for your openness in responding to all of our questions this evening. We're drawing close to the end of our time, and I wanted to offer Liz a couple of minutes to offer any closing remarks that she might. Oh, I see someone here who has his hand raised with maybe a question before we do that. Let me just check here and see what that is. If I can find it. Yeah. Oh, and I'm not seeing where. I saw that, Dave. I'm looking for the where it appears here, and I'm not finding it. There is. Okay, what I'm going to do, since I'm having a little trouble here finding where his hand is raised, I'm not finding it on my screen. So let me. I'm going to go out of this view for a second here and try to.
Sandy, if you have the power to unmute George Amon.
That's what I was going to do.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. So let me find him here. There he, oops. Okay, George, I'm asking you to unmute since I'm not finding your raised hand here. Okay, there you go.
Can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can.
The great social movements of the 19th century, including abolitionism, were built upon the great religious revivals of the 19th century. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And that leads to the question of what can the church organizations do to work with the Poor People's Campaign. There should be a great outpouring by people of faith in this movement. The movement will succeed the best, I think, if it proceeds from the basis of a religious revival. Is there a parallel between this time in history now and the conditions that led to the First and Second Great Awakenings in the 19th century? You're a scholar, you know all the answers.
I surely do not know all the answers.
Now she's muted.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I just muted you by accident. Back to. This technology is great when it works out perfectly, and it doesn't work out perfectly with me. I'm not the expert on this. Okay, Liz, you should.
Perfect. Yep, you can. So I was saying I do not have all the answers, but I do have a response still, which is that before we launched the Poor People's Campaign, we thought it was really important to have faith bodies already engaged, already committed. So we had started with just grassroots people, grassroots organizations. We had gone state to state. It was just those that came forward. A lot of people were saying, well, don't you need to be going to the big national organizations? And we said, you know, if we build it, then folk will come, but that this needs to be rooted. But when it came to the question of faith leadership, we said, we are not going to have the same problem that the 1967-68 Poor People's Campaign had, which was that there were really almost no faith bodies that had gotten on board with that campaign until Dr. King's assassination. And then when folks did get involved, it was mostly as a memorial. It was mostly as a, like, we feel bad, so we're going to be out there. And so when we launched and we called for the launching of the campaign, we did so with national faith bodies, denominations coming forward. And we put out this challenge. We said, we don't want just a resolution passed. We don't want just, you know, lip service to this. We don't want this. We want, if your faith body is going to get involved, we want the top leadership to the local membership to all be involved. And we were going to be engaging in massive nonviolent civil disobedience. We needed a commitment that faith leaders, that people of faith, that clergy, that bishops were gonna engage in nonviolent civil disobedience with us. We needed a commitment that it wasn't going to be a couple of staff people, but it was going to be passed down through different adjudicatories, different, denominational offices, and into the local congregations and membership, and that folks would put out in their communications. And so I think indeed there is another revival that is a multi-faith revival, but it's taking place. And we have about 20 national faith bodies representing millions and millions of people, Jewish folk, evangelicals, Catholics, various stripes of Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, all kinds, native and indigenous leaders. We did what we kind of do when we were traveling before we had to take everything online like this. We hold mass meetings, like the old mass meetings and revivals and kind of services of various movements of the past. And we did one in New Mexico very early on, and there was a Muslim leader doing a call to prayer, and a Pentecostal who was speaking in tongues, and a indigenous woman who was honoring the spirits and the earth, and it was all happening at the same time. And as a Christian, it felt like it was it was the Pentecost. It felt like it was a moment, and we have lots of those kinds of experiences where there really is a revival. There really is, and some of the forms of organizing that are taking place are taking place, that they show themselves as a multi-religious space, but still a spiritual and a revival space. Reviving people's hope that it can be different. Preparing people to keep up the fight, and making sure that people are well aware that that God hates poverty, and that we're called to engage in holy disruption, and deep organizing. I mean, there are lots of examples from history. One that is a favorite of mine, and I really encourage folks here, if you're interested, to learn more about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, a group of Black and white sharecroppers that were organizing around the Great Depression, who their whole form of organizing was in revivals, was in, and we take a lot of lessons from there and apply it, to different conditions and different communities. And different religious groups today, but still, indeed, that we need to, we need a moral revolution of values, and we need a movement that can embody all of our sacred and religious texts and traditions, and really bring this kind of reign of justice to earth. And so.
I love envisioning that. It makes me think of, we do an interfaith service for peace and justice every year, and just seeing that whole diverse group of people gathering, doing things the way they do, but then joining together to pray for the same things that we all wish for. And I thank you for sharing that. I'm going to actually share my screen. I have a sheet that has some links that I think will be helpful for folks. And I added a couple of those. Can you all see the screen now that I have shared? There's a number of links there. That'll be in the recording as well, and I will share that out afterward. But I'd included the Poor People's Campaign website, but I also included the voting resources, and also the someone had posted Pennsylvania link. So I thought that would be good for you all to be able to go back and see and learn more about the Poor People's Campaign. But I'm also sharing some links for the council that may be of interest. We do a regular news summary that's posted on our website, and that's there. You can subscribe to that and get action alerts and the news summary when it comes out. We did a special election and voting page for this year, which I will be distributing to our network soon, within the next few days. And this is what I've tried to do, is pull all of the resources that we know of into one place to help people. And I'm sure it includes a lot of the same information that you'll find with the Poor People's Campaign, and probably a bit more. Um, this will be posted going forward on our Facebook Live page, and I will be uploading the recorded version of Zoom to our YouTube channel. So hopefully you'll get to do that. But just a few things. I want to reinforce the voting message. I'm encouraging you to check your registration before the registration deadline runs out. We have not had, that I know of, issues with voter purging so much here in Pennsylvania, but I think it's always a good thing to check. If you haven't registered, register, please get that done. If you would like to become active by becoming a poll worker, there are places where poll workers are still being sought. Liz spoke about that. And also you can volunteer to do election protection. So the other thing is to make sure that you deliver that message to everyone in your orbit. Make sure that people know they need to be registered, that they make a plan to vote, and that you make a plan to vote. You can vote by mail. That needs to be done as soon as possible to ensure that your vote is received. Some counties have drop boxes, others you can drop it off at the Board of Elections, or you can mail. Make sure you mail it in plenty of time so it's postmarked by no later than 8 p.m. on November 3rd, and it has to be in by no later than 8 p.m. on November 6th. But the sooner you can get that in, the better. So thank you again to Liz for joining us this evening. And I think I express the gratitude of all of us who've joined on Zoom and Facebook Live this evening in thanking her. Many thanks also to Reverend Di Morgan and Kelsey Reyes for your help in negotiating our way through this program. And finally, thanks to all of you who've joined us. We hope that this event has encouraged you to join in our work and in the work of the Poor People's Campaign. So we're leaving you now in time so that you can join in coverage of the vice presidential debate that begins at 9 o'clock if you're so inclined to do that. And finally, 3 closing words: vote, vote, vote. So thank you for being here this evening.